Alright guys, are you ready to finish Bunny Call? This is the final chapter, so to speak, although there definitely will be more books in the series. I have a feeling this time we're going to get some answers, to both the things going on with the Stitch Wraith and just the things going on in the story in general. Maybe we'll even have some answers for weirdness going on in past stories. But regardless, no matter what happens, today we are finishing The Man in Room 1280, which has proven to be very, very strange so far. Where we left off, just as a reminder, Nurse Colton, all the other nurses had tried to kill the man, and now Nurse Colton is trying as well, because they believe it's the right thing to do, since they think he's evil, even though he hasn't really shown any signs of being evil, except for, being very good at staying alive. But yeah, okay, let's continue. Whereas Nurse Ackerman was cut off from her emotions, and Nurse Thomas was too enslaved to hers, Nurse Colton thought she was the perfect balance of heart and brain. She felt, and felt deeply, yes, but she also had a depth of reason that the other two women lacked. She had to have this balance. Nurse Colton had been on her own since she was 16. When her parents died, Nurse Colton had decided to forego foster care. She had instead run away, found a woman who made fake IDs, and got a job on a cruise ship, a job that came with free room and board. Over time, she'd saved up enough money to pay for nursing school. Now she was here because people like her lost people like her parents. It was only right to use what she knew about it to help others. On her way down the hall to room 1280, Nurse Colton saw the little boy run into the storage room. She still had no idea whether he was real or supernatural. She suspected the latter, but if he was some kind of ghost, she didn't know what to make of him, and she didn't know how to make him go away, so she figured she'd deal with one mystery at a time. At the door of room 1280, Nurse Colton stopped, and set down the tote bag she carried. Looking back down the hall, she pulled out eucalyptus oil combined with a carrier oil. She put a dab of the oil mixture above her upper lip. The strong aroma, she hoped, would block out the contemptible stink in the room. After one more look down the hall, Nurse Colton pulled a plain white pillar candle out of her tote. She stepped into room 1280, and she set down a candle. Then she pulled out another candle, and set it a few feet from the first one. One after the other, she placed candles all around the perimeter of the space. Once she had the candles in place, Nurse Colton pulled a lighter from her tote bag, and she methodically lit every candle. After the candles were lit, Nurse Colton closed her eyes and imagined expanding the candle's light until it filled the entire room. Then she turned and looked at the man in the bed, and she said, "This room is filled with the light of good. No shadow can enter or do mischief here." She stood very still to make sure her intention was strong enough. Yes, it felt right. Nurse Colton believed in the power and intention of human will. Both had helped her survive the loss of her parents and build a life on her own terms. Both would serve her now. She was sure of it. Good. It was time. Nurse Colton set down her tote bag and looked at the man in the bed. Unlike Nurse Thomas, Nurse Colton preferred to face the ugliness of life head-on. Yes, the man's fire-blighted bones and nearly calcified insides filled her with revulsion, but she could handle it. Now, she was going to rid the world of it. Nurse Colton pulled out a syringe. It held no drug. It was a syringe of air. She figured if she could get the thing in the bed to breathe, it could die of an air embolism. Leaning forward, Nurse Colton began injecting the air into the IV port in the thing's forearm. She had no doubt she'd succeed, because she knew she was standing in a protective circle. This circle was so strong that even if the shadow, or whatever it was inside the circle when she cast it, the circle would stop the shadow from doing what it wanted to do. As she began to depress the plunger on the syringe, her protection circle failed. Lacerating the air in front of Nurse Colton, a shadow swept across the syringe. The syringe leaped from her hand, spinning just once before shooting like an arrow toward Nurse Colton's throat. Stabbing deep into her skin, just above the collarbone, it vibrated, sending jitters through her neck. Nurse Colton knew if she didn't grab the syringe immediately, the air in that syringe was going to kill her. So she reacted instantly, jerking the syringe from her neck, only to have it snatched from her hand again. This time, she held up her hands in surrender. The syringe fell to the floor and snapped in half. Then, a hot, musty blast of air rushed into the room and extinguished every candle flame. The candles flew back and smacked the walls. Nurse Colton had never had her intentions so violently defied, and she was rattled, but she wasn't going to show it. She looked at the vile mass on the bed. "We'll find a way," she said. A giggle came from outside the hallway. Nurse Colton rushed to the door, and she ran right into Nurse Vermont, who stood still like a statue, staring down the hall. "He went that way," Mia told Nurse Colton. "Who?" she asked, looking stunned. The little boy." "I'm beginning to think it's not a little boy," Nurse Colton admitted. Mia nodded. "Me too." The nurses stood there, in silence, looking down the hall. Then Mia asked, "What just happened? You saw?" Mia nodded. She wasn't afraid. Nurse Colton cocked her head and studied Mia for several moments. "You're curious," she concluded correctly. Mia nodded again. "Okay, come in." Nurse Colton went back into room 1280. Mia tried to follow, but she had to stop in the doorway and cover her nose. Mia liked to keep lists. She kept lists of the best things in life. Best experiences, best sights, best tastes, best smells, best sounds. And she kept lists of the worst things in life. 3 of the smells on her worst smells list were rotten eggs, dead bodies. She'd unfortunately once been the one to discover the body of an elderly woman in an adjacent apartment without family to check on her. It was the smell that had led to the discovery. And a skunk spray. The smell in this room was worse than Mia's 3 worst smells combined. "Oh," she said. "Try this." Nurse Colton handed Mia a small container of essential oil. Mia sniffed it, and then rubbed some of it above her upper lip. It was not better, but it was okay for now. Still, Mia stepped into the room. She didn't know what she expected to see, but it wasn't this. What was this? "The poor, poor man," she whispered. Nurse Colton looked at the bed and sighed. Then she said, "Yes, but the man isn't the problem." Mia glanced at Nurse Colton and then returned her gaze to what lay in the bed. Mia had never been squeamish. In fact, she kind of enjoyed the gory stuff. She looked at the elderly cadaver she discovered, stared right at the mass of maggots, and thought, cool, it was nature at work. But this wasn't nature. This was the exact opposite of nature. It was a violation of the very idea of nature. Neither a skeleton nor a man, this brittle bone container of decaying organs and tissue, still somehow managed to sustain life to result in the brain activity Mia could see on one of the monitors. That was just fundamentally wrong. If that's what's inside, that's the problem, Mia said. "Yes," Nurse Colton said. Mia thought about the conversations she'd heard. The conversations about evil and extermination. Now they had context. Turning, Mia met Nurse Colton's direct gaze and nodded. "I think I understand." Mia was a genius. Arthur had felt like a spoiled child, following the administration staff around, asking over and over for permission to take the man in room 1280 to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center. He couldn't, however, argue with the results. In spite of the vociferous and numerous objections voiced by the nurses at the hospice wing, and even more from others in the hospital, when they signed a petition, Arthur received a call late that evening before telling him he could take the man in room 1280 to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center if he came in and signed a multitude of papers absolving the hospital from any responsibility for whatever might result from the trip. So, once again, Arthur pedaled toward Heracles Hospital. Today, he was wearing full rain gear because there was no arguing with the colossal churning storm clouds that dominated the sky. Not a single ray of the sun's light was finding its way through the black and gray cloud stacks that made it seem more like twilight than 10:10 in the morning. Rain began falling as the hospital came into view. Arthur kept his head down, navigating by the markings for the bicycle lane at the right edge of the driveway. Every car that sped past sprayed Arthur with water and buffeted Ruby so her tires wobbled a little on the pavement. Arthur was relieved when he glanced up and saw that he was almost to the portico. But then his feet rumbled with Ruby's pedals. Had he just seen what he thought he'd seen? Glancing up at the portico, taking in the majesty of the building's vine-covered facade and its intricate statuary, he was sure he'd just seen a child's head peek out from behind the stone Cerberus. Arthur braked, wiped his eyes, and stared through the gauzy rain curtain separating him from the hospital. He squinted, focusing as intensely as he could on Cerberus and the top of the columns flanking the portico. No, nothing was there. He must have imagined what he'd seen. All that talk about the little boy, it had put the idea in his mind. But he didn't think he'd imagined it. Arthur tried to take a last look, but the rain curtains turned into solid walls of water, pounding the earth as if Mother Nature was trying to obliterate an enemy. Now Arthur could see nothing but rain, so he stood on Ruby's pedals and got both himself and his poor drowned bicycle under cover. 10 minutes later, still dripping water wherever he went because he carried his wet rain gear with him, Arthur sat in front of a very different desk from all the desks he'd sat in front of during his campaign for the trip to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center. This wasn't the desk of some low-level paper pusher. This was the desk of someone with power. In this case, legal power. Arthur sat in front of the desk of Carolyn Benning Graves, Heracles Hospital's head attorney. Ms. Graves had much nicer chairs than Pete and all the others in the administration office. Arthur was quite comfortable in a burgundy leather wingback chair. You understand, Father Blythe, that any damages resulting from this patient transport, be they property or personal, shall be wholly and completely your responsibility. Arthur nodded. I understand. His stomach did a somersault. What if something went wrong? Arthur adjusted his altitude. Where was his faith? He and the man in room 1280 would be watched over. The attorney pushed a stack of papers across the clean, polished surface of her mahogany desk. Please read through these agreements, sign where indicated, and initial where specified. Arthur started to lean forward. Not here, Father Blythe, Miss Graves said. She made a motion, and a thin, well-dressed young woman appeared and picked up the papers. Please go with Miss Weber here. She'll take you to a place where you can read and sign. I'm afraid I have another appointment. Arthur dutifully vacated the wingback chair, feeling victorious. Mia hovered in the hallway outside the hospital's legal offices. She'd been told Father Blythe was still signing papers giving him the authority to take the man in room 1280 to Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center. In spite of those papers, she'd hoped she'd be able to talk him into giving up the idea. Leaning against the wall, Mia nodded and smiled at everyone who went by. But she didn't really see anyone. Her mind wasn't in this hallway with her. It was reviewing what had led her to this place, and this time, and this mission. Mia hadn't really understood why the only job she could find was on the hospice wing at Heracles Hospital. She was highly qualified and had excellent references. She should have been able to get a better position. In fact, she'd been feeling pretty resentful that she was stuck with what she'd gotten. If it wasn't for her boyfriend continually reminding her that the job was a stepping stone, they'd have been pretty miserable. But between his encouragement, his wonderful sandwiches, and her own naturally optimistic nature, she'd been reasonably content here, except for being creeped out by her fellow nurses on the hospice wing and their disturbing, hushed conversations. But now she understood them. Oh boy, did she ever. Mia also understood why she had gotten this job. She was needed here. Why, hello, Mia. Mia focused and realized Father Blythe was standing in front of her. What are you doing here? Mia smiled as she watched Father Blythe juggle a stack of papers, orange rain gear, and his bright red bicycle helmet. The rain gear dripped on Father Blythe's black leather shoes. For some reason, he always smelled like coconuts. Actually, I'm here to talk to you, Father, Mia said. She glanced around the busy hallway. Then she looked down the hall to a small waiting area. Could you come with me for a second? Father Blythe glanced at his watch. Peggy's going to be meeting me out front with the church van. It's wheelchair accessible. I'm going to trade her Ruby for the van. Then he looked into Mia's eyes. But, okay. Mia took Father Blythe's arm and led him down the hall. She smiled at everyone as they went, noticing that several nurses gave Father Blythe disapproving frowns. In the waiting area, Mia sat in one of the tan plush chairs and motioned to the one next to it. Father Blythe sat beside her. What is it, Mia? You seem troubled. I am. She looked at Father Blythe's warm brown eyes. He had such a kind face, such an open face. She could see that he'd known suffering, but she could also tell that he was resolute in his intention to see the good in everything. He had one of those mouths that curved upward, even when his face was expressionless. He was designed for seeing light in darkness. Realizing that he was waiting for her to speak, Mia looked around to make sure they were alone. She leaned as close to Father Blythe as she could, without being weird, inhaled, and then said in a rush, Father, I know I gave you that advice about how to get permission to take the man in room 1280 out of the hospital, but you can't take him. You just can't. The man in room 1280, he can't leave this place. I can't explain why I know this, but I know it. He can't go where he wants to go. You can't take him. The other nurses are right. I thought they were lunatics. I admit it. I did. But now I understand. They're right. There's something in that poor man. There's something in there, and you can't take it where he wants to go. You can't. It'll be devastating, even catastrophic if you do. I don't know how or why, but I do know it. You have to believe me. Mia stopped. She realized that she could gush forth another 1,000 or even million words, and Father Blythe wasn't going to change his mind. It was right there on his face. Lips pressed into compassionate regret, thick gray brows drawn together, crinkles drawn in at the corner of his wide-set eyes, slightly weak chin tucked. These were all telegraphing what was going to come out of Father Blythe's mouth. "Mia," he said when she'd finished her case, "I'm so sorry, but I have to take this man where he wants to go. It's his last request." "Just because it's his last request doesn't make it a good one," Mia attempted futilely. "Why is this so important to you?" Father Blythe asked. Mia had no logical answer. She wasn't about to explain what she'd seen in his hospital room. She knew how crazy it sounded, and she couldn't lose this job. But beyond what she'd seen, all she had was a feeling, an intuition. Maybe it was a premonition. "It just is," she said finally. Father Blythe set down his rain gear and bicycle helmet. He tucked the papers under his arm, and he took Mia's hand. "Mia, I've lived long enough to see the kind of evil that exists in our world. I haven't seen it all by any means, but I've seen more than enough to understand that my glass is always full attitude has no basis in earthly reality. I should be jaded by now, I suppose. I should be pessimistic, ready to see the worst. But I'm not. I'm not because I choose not to let the past color the way I see the present. I choose to expect, in every moment, to find what's good. But what if you don't? Then there's always the next moment. And what if there isn't?" Mia could hear the fear in her voice. She brushed away the tears that threatened to spill. Father Blythe breathed in and out slowly. "Then I'll move on to wherever my journey holds next for me, I suppose. That's all we can do. That's all I'm trying to do for the man in room 1280. Mia swallowed and nodded. "You won't change your mind. I'm sorry, but no." Mia stood, and Father Blythe gathered his things. "May I hug you, Father?" she asked. "Of course." They hugged, and she tried to pour into Father Blythe the inexplicably huge amount of warmth she felt for him. Or was it worry? They separated, and he said, "Bye, Mia. I'll see you again soon." "Bye, Father," she said, as he gave her a little wave and headed down the hall. Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center was a massive collection of reddish and white buildings that Arthur couldn't believe he had never noticed before. Looking like long, flat, metal-sided blocks, haphazardly placed in clusters by a gargantuan child, the buildings must have been here for at least 20 years. Low-slung and dotted with narrow windows, every one of them needed paint, or at least a good cleaning. Arthur was pretty sure the buildings had been bright white and bright red when they'd first been built. Along the sides of most of the buildings, slanted drives led to a cracked concrete loading docks. Even the big rig trailers tucked into at least a dozen of those docks looked like they'd been in service for a good long while. Some were rusted, many were dented, all were dirty. Admittedly, it was a dreary day, but Arthur was sure that even in bright sunlight, this distribution center would look like it needed a lot of TLC. The address of the distribution center, which Peggy had gotten for Arthur along with instructions for getting there, turned out not to be a building, but rather a small empty guardhouse and an open gate. Once through this abandoned entry, Arthur didn't know exactly what to do. He realized now that the man's designation of the Fazbear Center was almost like picking Iowa as the place he wanted to visit. What specific part of this place did the man want to go to? Arthur glanced in the rearview mirror at the sheet-enshrouded bundle in the wheelchair, locked into place behind the van's passenger seat. He still wasn't used to seeing the palpitating dried organs and veins in an upright position. He also wasn't used to the smell. Although he'd tried to talk himself out of it for the trip from Heracles Hospital to Fazbear Entertainment, Arthur was sure the man smelled worse with every mile they traveled. The van was filled with a grim stench of sulfur, feces, decomposition, blood, and bile. Ever since the man in room 1280 had been transferred from his bed to the wheelchair, he'd been leaking blood and viscous black fluids. The treacly mixtures were now soaking the sheet around the man and pooling on the van floor. Arthur knew it was going to take hours to clean up the van after this trip. In spite of this, the man sat upright in his seat. He was strapped in, but his head wasn't drooping. Of course, he had no eyes, but his eye sockets were directed ahead, as if he could see exactly where they were going. Feeling less and less about what he was doing, Arthur told himself to stop judging the poor man based on his appearance. He cleared his throat. "So, do you know where you want to go?" Arthur didn't really expect a response, but he got one. The man raised one of his crusty finger bones and pointed it in a direction that seemed to indicate the largest building in the Fazbear collection. It was also the building, Arthur noticed now, that had a large covered courtyard leading to a glass-fronted wall. That was probably the main entrance. Arthur realized he should have called ahead to get permission to bring the man to the distribution center, but maybe his failure to do so had been unconscious. What was that old saying? It was better to ask for forgiveness than for permission? Something like that. Arthur didn't want another battle like the one he'd had to fight at the hospital. To that end, Arthur decided not to head to the main entrance the man had indicated. "I'm going to find a side entrance, I think," Arthur said out loud. "Something more private. Are you alright with that?" The man didn't move, but Arthur thought he could hear a sloppy percussion emanating from the man's chest. Was Arthur hearing the man's heartbeat? Arthur suppressed the shivers that started at the top of his head, and did an arpeggio down his neck to his spine. Arthur put the van in gear and pulled it around to the side of the main building. The van's tires made fizzing sounds on the wet pavement. Arthur wondered how he'd transport the man into the building without getting him wet. Somehow, dousing a body with barely there skin didn't seem like a good idea. As soon as Arthur turned the corner of the big building, he saw the solution to his problem. This side of the building had van-sized loading docks under an overhang. "Ask and ye shall receive," Arthur said, smiling. He said a prayer of thanks for the help. At the far end of this row of loading docks, a couple of husky workers wearing back braces and scowls loaded boxes into a dirty white van. They paid no attention when Arthur pulled the church van parallel to the platform at the opposite end of the docks. "This should work," he said to the man. Of course, he got no response. Jumping out of the van, Arthur took in a cleansing lungful of fresh air. Well, not fresh exactly. The air smelled like grease and solvents, but at least it smelled better than the air in the van. Arthur opened the side door, removed the wheelchair, and jockeyed it into position on the ramp. Trying not to be too prissy about it, Arthur touched the blood-stained sheet and adjusted it to better cover the man. He had nothing to wipe his fingers on, but he ignored the issue and wheeled the man into the building. Inside the roll-up door openings of the loading docks, the building revealed itself to be the heart of the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, stretching so far into the distance that Arthur couldn't see the end of them. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held stacks and stacks of boxes and plastic-enclosed packages. Peggy had told Arthur that Fazbear Entertainment created parts and costumes for animatronics used in restaurants and other venues. It also created costumes for humans to wear and other various toys and other merchandise related to their most famous characters. Arthur assumed that's what was all in the boxes and packages. It also explained the faded murals on the pale yellow walls. The murals depicted a variety of outlandish animal characters of questionable purpose. Despite their cheery appearance, Arthur couldn't be sure they were intended to be friendly. In front of the shelving area, a series of conveyors took boxes and packages on journeys through the building, journeys that would probably end up near loading docks. A few workers monitored the conveyors, while others drove forklifts down the rows of the shelving area. A tall man with red hair wandered about, carrying a clipboard, but he wasn't looking this way. The building was surprisingly quiet. Only the muted clatter of the conveyor, the hum of the forklift motors, and a few shouts and thumps broke up the cavernous hush of the place. "Well, here we are," Arthur turned to look at the man. And then the man started to convulse. Several thoughts tangled in Arthur's head as he watched the bones and organs and tissues in the wheelchair shake so uncontrollably that some of the man's rib bones cracked. When blood flew and tissue cinders began spewing, Arthur thought, "They should have let me bring a nurse, and what should I do, and why did I sign all those papers, and please guide me." Arthur leaned over the wheelchair just as the man collapsed into a mound of bone and an indescribable mass of fried human parts. At a loss, Arthur began to pray silently. But before Arthur could get through 2 words of his prayer, the man's remains heaved. Then they burst like a nightmarish egg blowing open to disgorge new life. Expelling rank-smelling blood and a tar-like substance in a frightful spray all over Arthur and the building's smooth concrete floor, the explosion of bone and veins and organs happened in an instant. In that instant, Arthur saw a void in the remains gape like a portal to hell itself. Then he was frantically wiping nauseating fluids and slimy body bits from his face. As he did this, he saw the man's body tumble from the wheelchair and Arthur knew the man was dead. Instinctively, Arthur began praying again, but as he prayed, he heard something that wiped even the thought of prayer from his mind. He heard a rush of pattering footsteps, little sprightly footsteps capering away toward the shelving area of the building. What was that? Arthur wiped his eyes again and looked around. At first, all he saw was the man's remains. For the first time since Arthur had gathered the courage to look at the man, all the exposed insides were still. Then Arthur's gaze landed on a trail of tiny footprints that were stamped in the man's charred blood and fluids. He followed the trail and saw the footprints continue away from the man, etching the floor in the man's blood like fearful hieroglyphics, marking the way. The way to where? The man had moved on, but something hadn't. "Father, is everything okay?" A man's voice, pitched high in shock, asked Arthur. Arthur turned. The speaker was the red-headed man with the clipboard. He stared at the floor, his face blanched, his eyes wide. "Actually, no, I don't think everything is okay," Arthur said. For the first time in his life, he was sure of it. Larson sat at the desk, ignoring everything else in the office. On any normal day, he'd have had trouble concentrating while Robert sprayed air freshener toward Powell's desk, while Powell bellowed at Roberts for spraying Powell's garlic-heavy meatball sandwich, while two drunk bikers hauled in for fighting continued trying to assault each other, and while the rest of the people in the office either talked to the phone or to one another. But today wasn't a normal day. Today, a marching band could have been doing formations between the desks, and Larson wouldn't have cared. Today, he was on to something. Or at least, he thought he was. Bending over the papers and photos in front of him, guarding them with his elbows so he didn't have to explain his ideas to anyone else, Larson first pored over the photos of the Phineas Taggart crime scene. They showed exactly what he remembered seeing when he'd arrived at the factory to crazy scientist laboratory conversion weeks before. Viewing the scene had been like looking at a modern-day Frankenstein's lab. The room where the scientist's remains had been found had been packed full of scanning equipment, modified in incomprehensible ways, and hooked up to the strangest collection of junk he'd ever seen. Most of the junk had been just as mystifying as the equipment modifications. Gears, and hinges, and mannequin parts, and antique contraptions that looked like medieval torture devices. But one collection of junk had been combined in an especially disturbing way. Looking at it had twisted Larson's insides and put his blood in a deep freeze. Because he'd been so rattled by what he was looking at, he hadn't looked at it closely. Now he realized he'd been an idiot. He should have looked harder. If he had, he'd have figured out what the Stitch Wraith was a lot faster. Or would he have? Even if he'd put it together, mightn't it have taken him some time to come to terms with it? Although he was sure now, he wasn't totally sure, because what he was sure of was totally insane. If he was truly certain, he'd be telling his colleagues. Instead, he was peering at the evidence as if it was a treasure he wasn't willing to share. Larson looked at the junk conglomeration that had so horrified him, and he knew he was looking at the beginnings of the strange figure he was looking for. In the photo he held, the doll's head could only be seen from the side. That's how Larson had seen it in Phineas's laboratory as well. This was why Larson hadn't immediately recognized the sketched face when he'd seen the picture in the chief's envelope. But that head, he was sure it was the head, was attached to a metal endoskeleton. Okay, so the mysterious figure was always described as wearing a hooded cloak, but Larson remembered seeing a long and voluminous hooded trench coat in Phineas's clothing. That could easily have been misidentified as a cloak. Larson set down the photo, and he began reading through the inventory list from Phineas's property. Running his fingers down the list, he read the items aloud under his breath. He stopped at the 10th item down. There it was. One robotic dog, disassembled, manufactured by Fazbear Entertainment. Larson looked at the endoskeleton again. It seemed to have an addition. So part of that dog could have been used on the endoskeleton. Okay, so we have an animatronic endoskeleton linked to a part that came from a Fazbear Entertainment robotic dog. Was he making too much of a leap connecting the dots? The dog connected to Fazbear Entertainment, which was connected to the Freddy's murders, and the dog connected to the thing with the sketched face. So that meant Larson's current investigation could be connected to the Freddy's murders. A paper airplane hit the top of Larson's bent head. He slapped at it and frowned, looking up. "Earth to Larson," Roberts said. The detective's close-set gray eyes were aimed at the photos Larson was shielding. "I asked what you were doing." "Thinking." "About what?" "Stupid stuff, probably." No way was Larson going to tell his straight-arrow partner, wearer of tweed jackets with leather elbow patches and too proud owner of a perfectly groomed goatee, about his fledgling theory. "Wanna grab some lunch?" "No thanks." Roberts stared at Larson for a moment. Larson stared back, his face as blank as he could make it. "Okay," Roberts said. Larson shot the paper plane back across his desk to Roberts. "Nice one," he said, hoping to distract Roberts from any suspicion that Larson was onto something. Roberts was almost as proud of his aerodynamic paper airplanes as he was of his facial hair. Roberts grinned. "Thanks." He got up and strolled away from his desk. Larson waited until Roberts was gone, and then he stood. He needed to get over to the evidence locker. He'd chew on his theory on the way. The old stone building that had originally housed the city police department, but this was now the department's annex, where the more obscure functions of the police department were carried out, and where all records and evidence were kept. In the evidence locker's musty basement aisles, Larson stood on a stepladder and pulled a stack of 3 battered boxes from a shelf above his head. Setting them on the floor, all 3 boxes side by side, Larson squatted in front of them and took off their lids. He coughed when the persistent odor of smoke wafted up from the boxes. Then he peered into each box. Larson's heart rate was in an on-to-something mode, thumping loud and fast in his chest. The fire, so far in the past it was almost ancient history in the department, had never been solved. Larson didn't know a lot about it, but he did know the fire was connected to one of the founders of Fazbear Entertainment. His idea was that if the Stitch Wraith was connected to Fazbear Entertainment and was seen at the site of the fire, the Stitch Wraith might have been looking for something that had been put into evidence years ago. He didn't think it was that much of a stretch to reach this conclusion. But the first 3 boxes didn't do much to bolster his theory. He replaced their lids and climbed up the stepladder. He climbed back down, shifted the ladder, climbed back up again, and pulled another stack of boxes from the shelves. This time he took the lids off one at a time. When he took the lid off of the 3rd box, he raised his eyebrows and nodded. Grim hadn't been back to the railroad yard since he'd seen that mysterious figure prying loose parts from the tracks. Something about that figure had done more than just make his teeth hurt. It had made him want to dig a very deep hole and crawl into it. Since he didn't have a shovel or the strength to dig such a hole, Grim had decided instead to move his usual hangout place to the far end of town, where abandoned factories rubbed shoulders with several stalwart old neighborhoods and the west dock of the lake. He found a rusted but sturdy shed just outside of one of the abandoned factories, a factory that had been so recently vacated that a shabby forklift still squatted nearby. The shed, although watertight and clean, hadn't been discovered by anyone else like Grim, so he set up a house under a long, wide shelf below a dirty window. Because he knew others could be attracted to such deserted locales, he was happy that he found the shelf in his shed made a suitable lounging platform for keeping an eye out on his surroundings. And it was a good thing he kept an eye out, because on his 3rd night in the shed, he spotted the mysterious figure. Happy that he was at least in his usual crazy thoughts tonight, he still had trouble continuing to breathe as he watched the figure drag a bag through a double garage door-size opening in the boxy metal factory shell. What compelled him to follow the figure to see where it went? Was it that curiosity he'd felt the last time he'd seen the figure? Or was it perhaps some self-destructive urge? Maybe it was the crazy voice in his head. Whatever it was, Grim found himself scurrying stealthily, and perhaps a bit unsteadily, toward the opening into which the figure disappeared. When he reached it, he hesitated for a second, questioning the wisdom of his actions, but he went through the opening anyway. Preparing to be jumped the second he entered, Grim was surprised and relieved to find himself in an empty triple garage-sized space that widened into another space beyond. and he was even more surprised and pleased to hear movement in that second space and see enough light to pick his way over the debris-strewn concrete floor. The dragging movement he heard was disconcerting, and would have sent any normal person running for his life. Grim, however, hadn't been normal in years. When Grim reached the front edge of the second space, he paused. He waited, listening until the scrape and swoosh sound of the dragging bag was far enough away to make him feel fairly certain he could follow without running into his quarry. It didn't take long for him to feel like he should make his move. Taking a deep breath for courage, he took another step, and he paused. He was in a huge square expanse, an expanse with flat walls and high ceilings, an expanse filled with piles of junk. He figured this was the main floor of the old factory. It was at least a couple thousand square feet in size, and its high ceiling peaked at a bank of skylights, which allowed murky daylight to brighten the area. Grim realized he stood on an elevated rim on the floor, a rim about 15 feet wide. It ran around the perimeter of the huge space. Several sets of concrete stairs with metal stair rails led down to a level about 6 feet lower. On that level, on one side of the cavernous square, a massive dirty blue trash compactor was set partway into the concrete floor. It had a filthy, scarred chute that led from the elevated rim down into its metal bowels. It was quiet and still now, but Grim could imagine it in action, pummeling trash and then tipping it out onto a shallow concrete pit near the end of the lethal enclosure. Near the trash compactor chute, a small shelf hung on the wall. The shelf held a pot with 2 bright red flowers shaped like starfish. Grim couldn't imagine anything looking more out of the place than those 2 flowers did next to the powerful eater of trash. Grim blinked and watched the cloaked figure drag his bag to one of the junk piles. He couldn't see what was in the bag, but he glimpsed a doll's arm hanging from the opening. Dressed in a bright blue dress with equally bright pink ruffles, the arm looked so innocent and sweet. It didn't belong in this room of metal and mechanical junk. Nothing belonged in such a room, because the junk in this room wasn't just any junk. It was the junk of nightmares, the junk of blood-curdling histories. The junk in this room was a collection of the worst mechanical monstrosities imaginable. Spotting the remains he'd seen removed from the tracks, Grim also saw the carcass of a robotic dog and several partial animatronic characters. It looked like someone had blown up a factory of creepy robotic toys and then piled up the remains. Not even the crazy voices in his head would convince Grim to stay in this room. He backed out and retreated as quietly and as fast as he could to his rusty shed. Jake, aware that he was being watched, but not concerned about it because he could sense the soul and the character of the person watching, emptied the latest bag of infected items on the shortest pile in the abandoned factory. It made him sad to see the doll's arm. Well, all of it made him sad, actually. Toys shouldn't have been things that held terror and anger and fear. They should have been containers for joy and love and laughter. Ever since Andrew had told Jake about all the infected things, Jake had been using the thing he and Andrew were in to gather all the stuff Andrew had infected. When he first had the idea to do that, he wasn't sure how he'd actually do it. He didn't know what he and Andrew were in then, just that it was made of metal and could move. But then he understood that he was in an animatronic endoskeleton run by a battery pack, and he understood he was looking at the world through a doll's eyes. None of that felt strange to him. The only thing he thought was funny was that the thing they were in was wearing a hooded trench coat. Going around in a trench coat felt really silly. And it was hard to go all over in this thing, too. Harder than he thought it would be. Andrew had infected so much stuff. Jake hadn't understood how tiring it was going to be to use his will to get the locations from Andrew's mind and make the animatronic go all over the place finding this stuff. Jake was feeling so worn out, like he had before he'd left his little boy body. He wasn't sure he could keep doing what he needed to do. Maybe he should just give up and let go. Jake hadn't done anything wrong. Why'd he have to be the one to fix Andrew's mess? Wasn't he a good boy? Didn't he deserve to have some fun? "I think we need peanuts, don't you, Jake?" a smiling man asked. A crowd cheered, and a different man called out, "Hot dogs, get your hot dogs here." "Maybe a hot dog, too?" the smiling man said. Jake froze with the empty bag in his hand. Was that a memory? Did he just have a memory? He cocked his head. Since he'd been in this metal endoskeleton, he hadn't had a sense of smell, but now he felt like he was inhaling the aromas of peanuts and hot dogs. He also could feel something new. His face, or the face of what he was in, suddenly felt warm, like he was outside in bright sunlight instead of where he was. inside in a dingy factory. This had to be a memory, because it for sure wasn't happening right now. It felt like a memory, and the man in his memory had said his name. No, wait. It wasn't just a man. It was his dad. Jake had just experienced a memory of his dad. "What are the flowers for?" Andrew asked. Jake ignored him. He was concentrating. The memory, if that's what it was, had felt really good. Jake wanted more of it. He closed his eyes and focused on the smells and sounds and sensations. "Let's have both," Jake's dad said. He motioned, and a man came over with a tray full of roasted peanuts in small bags. Jake felt himself settle into his little boy body. He looked out through this little boy's eyes, and he saw a big field of grass and a huge crowd of people. "Jake, what about the flowers?" Andrew said. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a watering can he left under the shelf, holding the flower pot.